Trump never thought he would see such a day. He never thought that while being the president of the most powerful country on earth, he would be on the line begging Xi Jinping, not for a deal, not for trade, not even for peace, but for mercy. Not with troops, not with tanks, but with bonds. The battlefield isn't Iraq or Korea, it's currency. Because right now, Washington is burning, not with fire, but with fear. A fear that the American dollar is no longer the sun around which the financial world revolves. That the unthinkable is happening. $648 billion. That's the trade volume BRICS just conducted in 9 months, and more than half of it wasn't in US dollars. It was in Chinese yuan. This isn't just about currency. It's about control. And as Trump scrambles to contain a global economic revolt, one question rises above the rest. What really happened? And is it already too late? And what is Trump trying to do now to save his face and ensure the fall doesn't happen while he is in power? In this video, let's find out. Before becoming the president, Donald Trump knew what he had to do against China and BRICS. Even one of the biggest reasons behind his trade war against China is the declining power of the United States on all fronts. Whether it's political, military, or economic, China has been on the rise, and now it's time when China will overtake. Therefore, immediately after becoming the president, Donald Trump issued a blunt warning to BRICS nations, asking them to stop trading in local currencies and revert to the US dollar. And it was more than a policy suggestion. It was a desperate assertion of dominance in a world that no longer responded to such ultimatums. American diplomats didn't whisper their concerns behind closed doors. They made direct calls, held tense bilateral meetings, and warned of serious consequences should BRICS continue down the path of de-dollarization. The message was clear. The dollar isn't optional, it's mandatory. But in issuing that demand, Washington exposed just how fragile its leverage had become. What it failed to grasp is that the world had changed. BRICS was no longer a loose coalition of developing nations. It had evolved into a powerful engine of global trade and political influence. Bigger in GDP, broader in trade, and more unified in vision, BRICS no longer needed the dollar as a crutch. Then came the shock. China's General Administration of Customs released figures showing that BRICS trade reached a staggering 4.62 trillion yuan in just the first 9 months of 2024. That's $648 billion worth of goods and services exchanged. But it wasn't the volume of trade that stunned observers. It was the currency behind it. Over 54.3% of these transactions were settled in Chinese yuan. The US dollar, which had once dominated global trade with over 70% usage among BRICS in 2018, now accounted for just 41.4%. This wasn't a dip, it was a plunge, and not a cyclical one, but structural. A tectonic shift in the global financial order, signaling that nations were no longer just talking about reducing dollar dependence. They were acting on it. However, this collapse in dollar usage wasn't born out of ideological rebellion. It was born out of necessity and strategic foresight. That's because for years, Washington weaponized the dollar, blocking access to SWIFT, freezing reserves, sanctioning financial systems, and punishing political disobedience through economic warfare. Countries watched and learned. They saw Iran's assets seized. They saw Russia pushed out of Western banks. They saw even NATO allies fined billions for violating US-imposed sanctions. The dollar had become a leash, and BRICS decided it was time to break free. Now, what's truly alarming for Washington isn't just the speed of the shift, but the quiet confidence with which it's happening. BRICS leaders didn't issue bold statements or challenge the US publicly. They simply moved their trade elsewhere, into an ecosystem of bilateral swaps, local currency settlements, and sovereign digital payment platforms. In doing so, they exposed a painful truth. The dollar's dominance was never about superiority. It was about lack of alternatives. Now that an alternative exists, countries are making the switch without looking back. At the heart of that strategy was infrastructure, not just roads or ports, but financial scaffolding strong enough to hold up an entirely different way of doing global business. In Shanghai, the People's Bank of China began constructing cross-border yuan settlement services, brick by brick, server by server, until the city emerged not only as a financial capital, but as the nucleus of non-dollar global finance. These were not press release moments. They were silent revolutions taking place from rail projects in Africa to energy contracts in the Middle East, all priced not in dollars, but in renminbi. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai and created by BRICS as an alternative to the IMF, has already issued more than $35 billion in project loans. These aren't tied to political reforms, austerity demands, or Washington's approval. These loans build metros in India, hydroelectric plants in Brazil, and digital infrastructure in South Africa. They fund development on the recipient's terms, not the lender's ideology. This has redefined what partnership looks like in the 21st century. More importantly, these shifts have psychological consequences. Countries long held hostage to dollar-based rules suddenly have options. Brazil now settles significant volumes of trade in yuan, no longer beholden to dollar volatility or U.S. inflationary cycles. South Africa has increased its exposure to renminbi-based financial instruments, viewing them as a hedge against Western unpredictability. India, traditionally cautious in aligning too closely with China, is now quietly trialing yuan settlements in trade with Russia, largely due to the sanctions fallout. And Russia, already excluded from much of the Western financial world, has embraced the yuan fully, using it to trade oil, defense technologies, and even luxury consumer goods. You see, this isn't a financial experiment. It's a fully operational parallel universe. By creating functional alternatives for trade, finance, and investment, China is offering more than a currency. It's offering freedom from the strings that have historically come attached to the dollar. And in this new world, countries no longer have to choose between prosperity and independence. They can have both by choosing the yuan. What makes the yuan's rise so threatening to Washington is that it isn't built on bravado. It's built on necessity. Nations aren't turning to the yuan because of ideology. They are turning to it because the systems it enables work better, are less political, and offer fewer risks of blackmail. In contrast, the dollar is increasingly seen not as a stable store of value, but as a liability in times of tension. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. Now, the psychological effect is real. Where trust erodes, behavior changes. And right now, behavior is shifting, transaction by transaction, contract by contract, toward the Chinese system. Washington may still believe in the illusion of a global economy revolving around its currency. But in Shanghai, Johannesburg, São Paulo, and Moscow, a new reality is unfolding. One that doesn't revolve around the White House, but around the renminbi. That's why Donald Trump launched his trade war against China. Yet it was pitched as a patriotic renaissance. Manufacturing would return to American soil. China would be punished for its trade practices. The global supply chain would be rewritten in red, white, and blue. But instead of breaking China, the tariffs became the spark that lit the BRICS economic engine on fire. They forced countries across the global south to reevaluate the risks of relying on American supply chains and pushed them straight into Beijing's open arms. The tariffs were not subtle. Key Chinese goods faced rates as high as 145%, with a broad 10% blanket tariff applied to many imports across the board, even from American allies. The result was a sudden spike in costs for electronics, automobiles, machinery, and consumer goods. American companies scrambled. Developing nations priced out of U.S. markets pivoted toward China. Beijing, seeing the shift, moved with speed and confidence. It ramped up production of intermediate goods, the kinds of components other countries need to assemble everything from smartphones to cars. Semiconductors, display modules, aircraft parts, and electrical machinery began flowing toward BRICS nations at a record pace. China's Ministry of Commerce reported double-digit growth in these sectors. Steel exports to BRICS rose by 8.6%. Textile exports jumped by 13.4%. High-tech components saw sharp increases as well. These were the same goods once destined for the American market. Now, they were feeding a new network of factories, from Brazil's industrial zones to Russia's defense complexes. At the same time, American industries were absorbing the blow. Importers passed higher costs onto consumers, retail prices rose, inflation ticked up. And yet the promised resurgence in American manufacturing never materialized. The reason was simple. Tariffs don't build factories. Infrastructure, supply chains, and affordable capital do. And while America raised walls, China built bridges to its BRICS partners. What began as a trade war to isolate Beijing turned into a global realignment that elevated it. Countries weren't picking sides based on politics. They were choosing efficiency, reliability, and cost. In that calculus, China beat America. And the irony is brutal. Trump's strategy to protect American jobs ended up making American exports less competitive and accelerating the diversification of global trade away from the U.S. economy. Allies like India, who might have been on the fence, found themselves rethinking supply partnerships. African nations, promised investment by Washington but stalled by bureaucracy, were receiving high-speed rail and industrial parks from Beijing instead. The tariff trap was supposed to corner China. Instead, it isolated the U.S. And now, while Washington clings to tariffs as a tool of leverage, the rest of the world is building an economic architecture that functions just fine without it. And at the same time, underpinning all of this is the U.S. Treasury bond, the backbone of American financial dominance. For decades, the world bought treasuries, funding Washington's wars, welfare, and global footprint, cheap debt, endless credit, and a dollar trusted as a reserve currency. But what happens when the trust breaks? According to Bloomberg Intelligence, foreign participation in Treasury auctions has plummeted from 66% to just 53.2% in a year. That's catastrophic. Even worse, China is slowly dumping treasuries, not dramatically, which would spook markets, but methodically letting them expire, declining reinvestment, reducing exposure. JP Morgan warns that if China accelerates this retreat, interest rates could spike 100 basis points or more. That would cost hundreds of billions annually just in debt service. And this isn't theory. The U.S. is projected to pay over $1 trillion in interest alone in 2025. But why does this matter? Because U.S. debt is now a weapon that can be used against the U.S., not by a military rival, but by a trading partner with better options. The dollar is not collapsing overnight, but it is bleeding quietly. And every trade conducted in yuan, every treasury bond that goes unsold, is a wound. It all came down to one phone call. Not a routine diplomatic chat, but a conversation layered with desperation, strategy, and symbolism. On June 5, 2025, President Donald Trump finally called President Xi Jinping of China, breaking months of silence amid an escalating trade war. For Trump, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Inflation was rising, bond markets were wobbling, and the dream of a self-reliant, made-in-America economy was collapsing under the weight of a truth Washington had long ignored. America still couldn't build its own future without Chinese minerals. Publicly, Trump framed the call as a success. He posted online that the conversation led to a very positive conclusion for both countries and assured reporters that Xi had agreed to resume rare earth exports to the U.S., especially for companies supplying critical industries. He even announced that Xi had extended an invitation for him and the First Lady to visit China, an invitation he happily reciprocated. It all sounded like a diplomatic breakthrough. But if you listened closely to Beijing's version of events, a very different story emerged. The Chinese official statement made a subtle but powerful point. Xi took a phone call from Trump. Not spoke with or called, but took. It emphasized that Xi did not initiate the conversation. That small choice of words flipped the entire power dynamic. It painted Trump not as a negotiator, but as a supplicant. And in China's deeply symbolic political culture, that nuance meant everything. Xi wasn't chasing peace. He was receiving a plea. That narrative was reinforced when China described the recent Geneva talks as being at the suggestion of the U.S. side, further signaling that it was Washington, not Beijing, that blinked first. Behind the smiles and softened rhetoric, there was a calculated psychological play at work. Trump had previously claimed that Xi had called him first, a claim that Beijing publicly denied. And now, with Trump initiating the conversation, Xi appeared to be reinforcing a carefully curated image, the strong, patient leader who doesn't beg, doesn't bend, and certainly doesn't dial first. For Chinese audiences, that portrayal elevated Xi's stature. For international observers, it raised an uncomfortable question: was Trump actually negotiating from a position of strength, or simply reacting to a crisis? Although the call did result in temporary licenses for rare earth shipments to U.S. automakers, the larger issues like export controls, AI chip bans, and currency disputes remained unresolved. More importantly, the optics were locked in. Xi was the gatekeeper, Trump the guest. Chinese officials took the opportunity to highlight that Xi reaffirmed China's principles and sincerity, while also noting that Trump had expressed great respect for Xi, had endorsed the One China policy, and even praised the presence of Chinese students in American universities. Whether these were genuine concessions or diplomatic niceties, Beijing used them to frame the U.S. president as aligning closer to China's worldview. This single phone call revealed a lot more than it resolved. It exposed the vulnerability at the heart of America's industrial ambitions, the imbalance in negotiation power, and the psychological advantage Beijing now enjoys. Trump may have gotten his rare earths, at least for now, but Xi walked away with a stronger hand, the better optics, and the quiet satisfaction of being the one who didn't call first. All this reveals that America is more dependent on China than the other way around. Less than 3% of China's GDP depends on U.S. exports, but U.S. industry is hopelessly reliant on Chinese inputs. From radar systems to smartphone chips, Beijing is in the bloodstream of America's supply chain. And if the call fails, if China walks away, it could dump treasuries, squeeze rare earth exports, and trigger a chain reaction, from bond market panic, rising interest rates, collapsing manufacturing, to the final blow to the dollar's global dominance. Meanwhile, BRICS is watching, and not a single member has shown signs of retreat. Instead, more are joining, all looking to break free from the dollar leash. Now, the message is clear: BRICS doesn't need America anymore. What do you think? Will BRICS back down and give up on its plan for a new currency? Or do you believe China will play it nicely, making Trump believe new currency is not coming, while making the yuan a global reserve currency? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on the fact that it's over for the United States and Trump, and other future presidents would only try to delay it. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching. and until the next video, stay tuned.